Use the quotient rule and simplify the expression. Assume that all bases are not equal to 0. To begin with, we can break this fraction up into separate fractions. The numerical part is 4/12, which is multiplied by the x squared over the x squared. And finally, we have the y to the 8th over y to the 3rd. To simplify, you can use a calculator on 4/12, or you can recognize that 4 divides into 4 once, and into 12 3 times. X squared over x squared can reduce to 1, but to keep it consistent with the other fractions, I'll write it as 1 over 1. Finally, we have y to the 8th over y cubed, so recall our quotient rule. When dividing two numbers with the same base, keep the base and subtract the exponents. So we get y to the 5th. When we go to write that back into our expression, we could just write y to the 5th, but again, I'm going to write it as y to the 5th over 1 to make our simplification clearer. Because now, up top, we multiply 1 times y to the 5th, which gives us y to the 5th, and on the bottom, 3 times 1 is 3. And that's our final answer. Use the power rule and the power of a quotient rule to simplify the expression. To raise a fraction to a power, we need to raise everything in the numerator to that power and everything in the denominator to that power. We start by looking at the negative, and it's being squared. A negative times a negative is a positive. Next, we have 6 squared, which is 36. Now we have u squared, which just gets written down as u squared, and the same with v squared. And that completes the numerator. In the denominator, we have w cubed, and that all needs to be squared. Recall our power rule. When raising a power to a power, you multiply exponents. Since 3 times 2 is 6, we get w to the 6th, and we write that in the denominator. Finally, when I squared the negative, I wrote down that it was positive, but it's not standard to leave that in our final answer, and since nothing else in this fraction will simplify, we recopy it without the plus. And that's our final answer. Write the following number in standard notation. To begin with, we write the decimal portion, and then we look at the power of 10 because it will tell us how many places to move the decimal point. Since the exponent is -5, we move the decimal point 5 places to the left. Notice after we move the decimal point 1 place to the left, we run out of digits. So we continue to count out the remaining places to the left, and then we fill in with zeros as placeholders. We recopy our number, putting the decimal point in its new location, and it's standard to write a 0 out in front. And that is our final answer. Subtract. To begin with, since there is nothing in front of the first set of parentheses, we can simply remove them. Or you can think about it as having a 1 in front that you are distributing. So the first product, 1 times 9x squared, simply gives us 9x squared. The 1 times the 3y squared also stays the same, as does the 1 times the -7. To subtract the second polynomial, we'll need to think of it as distributing this negative to each of the 3 terms in this set of parentheses. A negative times a positive gives us a negative, so we get -5x squared. And the negative times a positive 3y squared gives us a -3y squared. And finally, a negative times a negative is a positive, so we get positive 8. Notice that distributing a negative changed the sign of each term that was within the parentheses. Next, we have to see if we have any common terms. And the 9x squared and the minus 5x squared are common, so we'll write those near each other up front. The y squared terms are also common, so we write them next. And finally, the negative 7 and the plus 8 are both constants, so we write those common terms next to each other. Now we need to simplify. Our rule for simplifying common terms is to keep the variable part and add or subtract their coefficients. 9 minus 5 is 4, so we get 4x squared. These two terms are also common, and if we use our rule, we keep the variable part, and when we combine the coefficients, 3 minus 3 is 0, so we get 0y squared. But recall that 0 times anything is 0, so this simplifies to 0. And adding 0 doesn't change our final answer, so typically we just cancel them out and move on. Which brings us to the negative 7 plus 8. Those combine to a positive 1, so we write that down next. There's nothing else that will simplify, so 4x squared plus 1 is our final answer.